But let's start with this. President Trump now on his way back home following his historic second state visit to the U.K. Today focused on politics following yesterday's ceremonies with the royal family. President Trump met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The two leaders announced a new trade deal along with a, quote, historic agreement surrounding technologies like artificial intelligence. Now, during the announcement, the president reflected on several issues, including his disappointment with Russian President Vladimir Putin, the war in Gaza, and the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's late-night show.
Jimmy Kimmel was fired because he had bad ratings more than anything else, and he said a horrible thing about a great gentleman known as Charlie Kirk. And Jimmy Kimmel is not a talented person. He had very bad ratings, and they should have fired him a long time ago. So, you can call that free speech or not. He was fired for lack of talent.
And now let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi from London this hour. Olivia, good to see you. The president, we know, was asked about several topics during that joint press conference. What are the big takeaways here?
Well, Chanel, it's good to be with you. A couple of really big takeaways from that press conference between President Trump and Keir Starmer. One being their big disagreement. Keir Starmer says he's intending to fully recognize Palestine as its own state. That, of course, comes as the United Nations is meeting on Monday in New York. That's certainly going to be a top topic there. But President Trump was asked by one of the reporters, does he agree with that? Does he also think that? President Trump went on a long answer where he talked about the hostages from Hamas. He talked about October 7th, and at the end, he said, I disagree with Keir Starmer on that. We have a few disagreements, but that is one of them. So that was quite notable there. I also want to point out that President Trump, at some point during the press conference, was talking about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan back in August 2021, and there he said that the U.S. is trying to get back Bagram Air Base. Now, that was at one point the largest air base in the world. It was used by the U.S. and NATO. That was during the Afghanistan wars. And the U.S. largely abandoned that when we withdrew from Afghanistan. President Trump says he would like to get that air base back, citing its closeness to China and their nuclear weapons. A few other things I want to quickly tick through on President Putin. President Trump said that he is upset with him, that he has, not been able to make any advancements on ending the war in Ukraine. He said he didn't regret inviting Putin to Alaska, but he also said that he hopes that European countries stop buying Russian oil, or at least refined Russian energy from other countries in an effort to stop the war there. And lastly, one more point I want to make was about Jeffrey Epstein, who has been hanging over this trip quite literally and figuratively. At one point, his face was blasted on the wall at Windsor Castle. But he has been hanging over this trip because the British ambassador to the U.S., Peter Mandelson, was fired from his role last Thursday. And the reason why was because there was more of a relationship that he had with Epstein that was uncovered through some emails that were released last week. His dismissal was certainly a topic of conversation and one that the two leaders were asked about during that press conference today. President Trump immediately said, I don't know him, when talking about Mandelson. But Keir Starmer said that the reason why they fired him was because some information came to light, which wasn't available when he was appointed. And so because of that, he made the decision to get rid of this ambassador over his relationship with Epstein. And then Keir Starmer quickly pivoted to a different topic. But still something of quite note, given the history of Epstein here in the U.K., now led to the firing of a British ambassador to the U.S. Prince Andrew was not at the dinner last night because of his relationship with Epstein, removing him as a working member of the royal family. And, of course, the president's previous relationship with Epstein, as well as someone who he was associated with prior to his presidency.
All right, Olivia Rinaldi live for us from London this hour. Thank you. And joining me now on set to talk more about this is Nick Banner, a former U.K. foreign officer and 10 Downing Street official, now an adjunct associate professor of international relations at NYU. Great to have you on, Nick. So I want to start with asking you about this trade deal and what this says about relationship between the U.K. and the U.S. right now.
Yeah, so both sides really wanted to emphasize this tech prosperity deal today. And I think they both managed to do that. They didn't get really very difficult questions about anything else. I think it says a lot about the warmth that President Trump feels towards the UK. And that's really what the UK wanted to reinforce here. They've come away with this deal where a lot of the detail is yet to be nailed down, but it should involve quite extensive cooperation on AI, on nuclear energy, and on quantum computing. And we'll find out more about what exactly that means in the coming months.
And as Olivia was mentioning in her report, the president talked about so many different topics in that joint press conference with Keir Starmer, including, of course, the war in Gaza, recognition of a Palestinian state, and the war between Russia and Ukraine. Notably, the two sides did not agree on all of those issues. What does that say to us?
I think it says that things are sort of running along as normal. I don't think you would expect to have complete agreement on every issue. What we didn't see was any sort of very strong criticism either. And we have seen President Trump is quite capable of taking people to task if he really doesn't agree with them. So we saw a lot of talk about shared defense links, about shared objectives on Ukraine, and making peace around the world in other areas as well. So there's this one issue of recognizing the Palestinian state where they disagree. President Trump tells us that he also wants to see peace in the Middle East. So on the overall objective, they're in the same place, but there are going to be disagreements over specifics.
Okay, lots to follow here. Nick Banner, thank you so much.
Thank you.